Well, it's a pleasure to join you again. I hope some of the viewers were able to see the first of um, the rounds of these presentations. Today, I will not repeat the discussion that when we began the first presentation, where I outlined some of the fundamentals of economics and human reality. What we'll do today is pick up the second point here that's highlighted on examining the ethics of business practices, and in particular, the morality of profits. And then in subsequent talks, we'll look at the issues relating to class struggle, racial divisions, which will be the next one. And then finally, looking at sustainable growth and environmental concerns. Okay, so what I'd like to do today is get you to start thinking. I mean, we're all sort of showered with these so-called memes, where sometimes they're video images or perhaps still images with some very brief message. So these memes are with us all the time. It turns out that these are somewhat problematic. They're very simplified expressions to support some particular narrative. All of us are probably guilty at some point of either being amused by them or perhaps using them for our own purposes. Now, it turns out that if we approach these memes without some foundational knowledge, then they're empty, they're vacuous, they really don't offer much. And in fact, they can often have some very deep meaning behind them that cannot be really revealed simply by the image or the statement. You have to dig deeper, or they can be hiding an ugly reality. And so we really have to unwrap these memes. And in fact, I would even suggest that in general, these are not very productive techniques if we really want to convince people of a particular position. So, but let's look at a few, for example, relating to some commentary or comments about capitalism and profits. Now, we'll start with some viewpoints that go against capitalism and profits. And I picked two individuals here: Martin Luther King, an outstanding American who led the movement of nonviolence against racial discrimination in the United States. But he expressed some rather interesting, and I would suggest, well, to jump ahead of myself, somewhat problematic views of his understanding of capitalism. He suggested he equates the evil of capitalism with the evils of militarism and racism. And well, as you'll see, I find this is quite a stretch of the imagination. Similarly, Noam Chomsky, a linguist who's become a sort of public intellectual in the United States, suggests that capitalism could be equated to fascism, but a sort of soft form of fascism. Now, on the pro side, I picked two other individuals. One is Milton Friedman, and this in many ways is the focus of our discussion, where Milton Friedman famously or infamously made the remark. In fact, this is the title of an article describing his views on capitalism, that businesses have a social responsibility, not an economic, but a broad social responsibility to increase their profits. And so we're going to look into that. And in a sense, his views are echoed in the comments made by Deng Xiaoping when he began the modernization process in China, following the sort of ideas of Zhou Enlai. Deng Xiaoping was the one that actually put these into play. And so in understanding, I mean, there's a lot of deep meaning in what Deng Xiaoping was suggesting there. First of all, he was trying to convince the Chinese people that they needed to be open to the income inequalities that were going to inevitably follow the introduction of something like market capitalism in China after nearly at that point, over 50 years of Marxism, Leninism that had demonized capitalism and profits and those who were associated with it. Now, in order to unwrap this idea of Milton Friedman's that profits really reflect a social responsibility of businesses, I'm going to start with trying to discuss with you the social and individual aspects of human life. Now, of course, one of the criticisms of the opponents of capitalism is that it leads to an atomistic, it involves an atomistic individual that is detached from any sort of social interests or concerns. And in fact, this is an invalid criticism. I encountered this quite often with my Marxian opponents in debates that I had in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, where this was a common refrain that this atomistic individualism removed human beings from the rest of society, sort of echoing Marx's idea of alienation that we discussed in the earlier presentation. But it turns out that humans cannot thrive. Indeed, they probably cannot survive as separated creatures. That is, they are part of a human system. They depend upon it for their individual and collective well-being. And so it's a complete false sort of representation of capitalism suggests that it requires or involves individuals being removed from their fellows. Now, if we think about what civilization is, civilization is, in fact, it's a search. It's not a static outcome. It's a dynamic process where human beings are looking for ethical, moral, and stable social orders so that the individuals and the community can survive and flourish. So what we find then is that every human civilization, and because of the objective and historical circumstances, that search may begin from different positions. For example, the Asiatic cultures, as they might be referred to from a Western perspective, are often referred to as a hydraulic cultures, where rice production was an important aspect of the development of those civilizations. Now, under a hydraulic culture, where rice production is so important, you need a constant flow of fresh water in order to produce rice. Therefore, private property might be somewhat problematic in terms of someone possessing or controlling the headwaters, the water sources that could hold other people at hostage. So we could see that these hydraulic cultures might begin with a different perspective on private property, because there would be some difficulties that would threaten their capacity to prosper. So now, this idea of a social order then is an order in the sense of predictability of other people's human behavior. And this social order then needs to be general in terms of the rule structures. It needs to be equally applicable. It needs to be understandable, and so on. So these social orders are whatever it is that the body of human beings have discovered works for them. And what works for them today may not work for them tomorrow. So this is what generational change brings, is that new generations will test the social order that was established by previous generations, test it, challenge it, keep what was good about it, modify it where it was inadequate or inappropriate, and each generation moves on from there. So in fact, what I'm bringing up here is in a sense a challenge to Samuel Huntington's magisterial work that was on the clash of civilizations, where in fact the real struggle of mankind is a clash of generations, where over generations, these are where these conflicts come, and these conflicts are occurring within these different civilizations that might manifest themselves in terms of frictions outside of those civilizations as a way of distracting people from the existential crises that they might face from those generational challenges. So there's a variety of categories of social order. I'm going to look at two. First of all, there could be an imposed social order. Now, this is what we saw throughout much of the early history of mankind, up until certainly the 19th century, and perhaps in many countries into the 20th century. We had imposed orders. That is, either a king or a monarch or some dictator of some form, philosopher kings, an elite, was able to use threats of force or actual force in order to implement and support rules that were determined by them or some centralized elite. And those goals or those rules were arbitrary in the sense that they were the outcome of the thinking of that elite or the preferences of the monarchy. And in a modern sense, we would refer to these as states or governments as being the source of this imposed order. Now, of course, most people say, well, my interaction with the state is voluntary, but in most instances, it's not. It's difficult. If you're a citizen of Australia today, you cannot leave you cannot leave Australia or indeed New Zealand without the permission of the government. So there is a great deal, even in democratic countries, there's a great deal more use of compulsion, if not physical force. There's compulsion in the sense that citizens are required to adhere to certain rules that are imposed by the government. Now, another type of order would what we could call emergent order. Now, this is an evolutionary process that emerges not out of the mind of an elite or a particular individual, but out of the interaction of many individuals, in fact, humankind. This we could refer to as the title of a particular book, The Wisdom of Crowds. That is, where human beings over millennia have learned from testing out certain behavioral patterns, what it is that makes it possible for an individual and a community of individuals to survive and then to flourish. So the emergent order involves mutual consensus and mutual commitment and recognizes mutual advantage. So I'm advantaged by a law that says thou shalt not kill. That is, if I can't kill you, in principle, you're not allowed to kill me. So there's mutual advantage in that. Thou shalt not steal. If I cannot steal from you, you cannot steal from me. No one can steal from each other. So we see then that many aspects of life that we take for granted are really outcomes of this so-called emergent order. Now, no one sat around at any point in time and said, you know what we need? We need language. No, language evolved, language emerged out of human actions. It became a mechanism by which individuals found it was easier to survive, that is, to communicate their needs, their preferences, their interests, and eventually to flourish. That is, they could use that language then to their advantage to improve their overall conditions. The same is true with law. No one sat around and said, we should have law, or no one said we should have markets. All of these institutions, these very important aspects of our daily life, emerged out of human interactions. And we should not discount the importance of these. The opponents of the market are actually acting against human nature because they're insisting that human interactions should not be trusted, that we should trust the elite, not the human evolution, the human interaction over millennia that have delivered to us these important institutions, for example, as I mentioned, language, law, and indeed markets, or even private property, which we'll discuss later. Now, what we're going to be discussing today, now capitalism is actually a term that was introduced by Karl Marx. So it has an almost empty meaning, and it can if you're a Marxist, it has a negative connotation. People who support free markets may or may not see capitalism as the appropriate term. I tend to be somewhat of mixed minds in this regard because of the Marxist origins of the term. But what we're talking about here today is private property-based markets, where and capitalism could become a touchstone phrase, a reference point that we could consider. And the market-based system then means that there is either no or minimal state or outside interference with the free and voluntary human interactions that lead to economic exchange. So that is a general reference for capitalism. So here's some important elements of this thing that we might call capitalism. It involves voluntary, lawful, and peaceful exchange of goods, services, property, resources that are a way of us discovering what other people value. So if we, and I'll discuss this in some more detail, if people own something, then you can come to terms with other individuals who may also value that thing, that good or service or property or resource, and come up with voluntary ways of transferring from the current owner to a future owner. So in other words, this is what makes it peaceful. If someone else has something that you desire, you could steal it from them, or you could trade with them. Markets allow us to trade peacefully. In absence of markets, either we rely upon the state to use compulsion to make transfers occur, or in a more sort of a Hobbesian state of nature, we might, the strongest and the fastest might be the one that determines who has what. So what we see under capitalism is that it's a way of sharing our value with other people. That is, these transfers are an indicator of what is valued and the level of value assigned to products or services based upon what people are willing to give up for. Now, profits are a key element to this capitalist system, if you will, because it is the inspiration for entrepreneurs to search for something to offer to people that will reward them for producing something of value to them. So it's an inspiration. That is, entrepreneurs are constantly searching for profit opportunities, and it's the reward. when they are able to accomplish that. And of course, obviously, every entrepreneurial action does not lead to success and profits. Some entrepreneurial actions lead to profits only momentarily because they will, if the state does not intervene, they will be contested or they will be overturned by technological change. But what we see is that profits are an important source of dynamism of an economic system. The reason many of the grand experiments of the 20th century with Soviet communism or communism in mainland China was that they lacked that dynamism. There certainly was a certain element of dynamism in those systems, but not enough to lead to an improvement in the overall standard of living. And it was only in those countries where there was, in general, a certain window of opportunities for profit seeking that we saw real dynamism that led to the improvement of the standard of living, especially of the workers, especially of the so-called proletariat. Now, because we're speaking about morality of capitalism, let me give you some of my own thoughts on this. Now, so that you can see where I'm coming from. So I begin with the idea that morality applies to all humans and all human action. So morality really is focused on the individual. And it is in the sense that individuals as agents of possessing free will, as I will suggest, is the case and will be the case in general in absence of autocratic rule from a state or a government. Now, our moral judgments and our moral actions arise from habits in early life. That is, we learn by how we're instructed by our parents, by observing our fellows. We could look at children in a nursery school or a kindergarten. They're constantly aware of what goes on around them, and they tend to imitate those behavioral patterns that lead to rewards or reinforcement of some kind. And so now, of course, we all develop our own personalities within that, but there'll be a broad overlay of a sense of what is appropriate moral behavior through these human interactions. So, in other words, we're not really born with moral instincts, but these are not, they do not in any way contradict nature. That is, nature doesn't give us these moral instincts, but our moral instincts can be consistent with not only human nature, but also with the natural environment based upon the human interactions that identify what is deemed to be appropriate behavior or acceptable behavior within the cultural or civilizational context. Now, in order to judge whether an act is moral or not, we have to start with the individual. Now, if you talk to a religious authority or philosopher, they almost all of them, and again, going back to Aristotle, will point out that moral actions are the outcome of voluntary individual choices. Now, if you do something because you've been compelled to do it, even if that leads to what could be deemed moral outcomes, the action itself was not immoral because it was forced. You didn't do it because you thought it was the right thing. You did it because you had to do it, and you would be punished if you did not. So moral actions can only be ascribed to individual choices, and they must be choices. So that if a governor decides on what is appropriate moral behavior, and he commands his subjects to do that thing. Now, number one, it's problematic because, as we shall suggest, morals are highly subjective. They're not immutable. They do change according to time and different civilizations at any moment in time or across time will have different moral standards. But if you are forced to do it by a governor, the state, or a government, then your actions cannot be deemed to be moral, and their actions, even if they are somehow truly moral, if they're compelling other people to do it, you cannot consider a decision made based upon compulsion to be moral. So actions that are autonomous, that is, chosen by the individual, and derived from the inner life, that is, from our sort of struggling with and understanding, is how do we fit in with the community? What's the appropriate way for us to be accepted by the family, perhaps, but community, the mankind, humankind. This sort of inner turmoil, this sort of inner questioning that we would have, guides us and indeed may govern our sense of action or our choice of actions, so that a child that would be desiring candy that goes into a supermarket and there's lots of candies available where, gosh, they could just take one and eat it and who would know? But there could be that inner struggle, and that would suggest, no, that's inappropriate, that's wrong. Not just because I'll be punished, but because it's wrong. And this is how life unfolds before us, is that we have these inner struggles, and there are signals or memories or insights that we derive from previous interactions. Now, whenever your choices or your behavior is involuntary, or if it, in other words, coerced, it takes away the moral content. So that if the state says the distribution of income is wrong, now again, that's a highly subjective interpretation. Where is it written that a particular income distribution is optimal or satisfactory or the best? Okay, but on the other level, if they say that, and you must give up what you possess, and you're compelled to do it, there's no moral content in your act. You're forced to do it. The moral content in your act is if you decide as an individual that you are unhappy with the distribution of income within the family, within the community, within the country, and you as an individual choose to take from your own stock of income, your flow of income or your stock of wealth, in order to provide that to other people, that is moral. But if it's done through the state, there's no moral content in those actions. So political actions, that is the action of politicians or the impositions of bureaucrats, have no real objective, I should have put objective moral basis. Now they might choose to identify these particular positions that they possess or exhibit based upon their own moral understanding, but it cannot be universal. It is not objective. It is subjective in terms of their own interpretations. So even if they say, and if they believe that it's a good outcome that they're pushing people towards, and they can make all the assertions in the world that they wish, but again, these good outcomes are not universal, and in terms of the interpretation of what those outcomes might be, and where a given community should be. In other words, what we see through state action is part of this imposed social order rather than an emergent social order. Voluntary actions are what lead us to an emergent social order, which is more peaceful, it's voluntary, it's cooperative, and so on. Now, another element here is that, try as they may, legislators, governors, cannot impose morality through their rules. Morality is it is a choice made by the individual based upon human interactions. And again, the sense of morality changes over time, and it changes across time for different cultures. So that I'm living in Massachusetts, where recreational marijuana use is legal. There are clinics here in the little village where I live. When I was a graduate student, it was both illegal and broadly considered immoral to consume marijuana. So we see that morality is tested over time, over generations, and we find that except for some core beliefs, which could be, for example, just for the sake of an example, the 10 Commandments are an example of a sort of a persistent set of rules that identify or provide guides for human behavior and limits to what is acceptable that have stood the test of time. Now, any cooperation that increases net benefits, that is overall benefits relative to cost, is moral. In other words, it is good. Now, this is important because the essence of market exchange is cooperation. It's not competition. It's not like what we see in the Japan Olympics that are going on as we speak. The essence of market exchange, of capitalism, is cooperation. And this is important to understand because capitalism will not operate without individuals who are allowed voluntarily to interact in order to engage in some form of trade or exchange. Now, the idea of cooperation is that you possess something that I value more than you value it, as indicated by your willingness to transfer it to me based upon what I offer you. So in other words, we have to enter into this cooperative arrangement. We find that that Jeff Bezos did not become the richest man in the world. If he is at the moment, someone else may have transplanted him, most likely someone in China. But he didn't become rich by compelling people to trade with Amazon. He provided the opportunity for people to cooperate with him or his particular app or website. So this is an act of cooperation. It was voluntary. People could have gone to the corner market, corner store, and bought those things. They were not compelled by any set of circumstances to only buy from Amazon. When I lived in Thailand recently, I could have bought from Lazada or Shopify. There are lots of other possibilities around the world. So that what we need to understand before we really begin to unwrap the idea of capitalism is that cooperation is at the heart of capitalist markets and exchange. So what I'm going to do is pose a few questions here to look at what are common moral criticisms of capitalism. So we start with this one. One of the claims is that capitalism encourages or actually builds into people's instincts selfish attitudes. That is, again, this is this atomistic individualism claim, and that pushes aside any kind of altruism, that is, a willingness to help others. Now let's start with the idea behind this. Well, first of all, neither predation, that is, theft and force, nor altruism is a virtue in and of itself. Now, many people will tend to unquestionably accept the idea that altruistic behavior is something not only that is good, but it should be imposed on other people. But again, this is contradictory. If you impose on people to behave altruistically, then their actions are not altruistic. They're the outcome of compulsion, not of empathy or sympathy for others. So on their own, they're not a virtue, partly because they both negate value. Now, predation, that is, compulsion to take away from other people, stealing from other people, implies that you don't hold other people's lives at the same level as your own. That is, you put them below you in the same way that altruism is. If I live my life in an altruistic way, then I'm putting my life before yours. Now, our lives must be considered equal. So altruism as a guiding principle is no better than self-interest in this regard, in the sense that they're not virtues as such that should determine our actions. Now, predation involves the sacrifice of others, while altruism involves the sacrifice of self. So, as I suggest to you here, that neither of them are considered virtues because they both undermine human personal dignity. That is, I think, a critical aspect of human life, that we must value our life in order to value other people's lives. And if we are constantly making self-sacrifices, then we're not recognizing the value of our own lives to be part of other people's lives. So egoism or self-interest does not necessarily require selfishness or greed. Now, the movie Wall Street with Michael Douglas many years ago made the expression "greed is good" a popular reference to capitalism, or in fact, they were talking about the mechanics of Wall Street, stock traders and brokers that lived a somewhat otherworldly life. But in fact, the idea of the egoism that we describe under capitalism is consistent with your capacities to look at other people with empathy or sympathy, and to react as if you were in their place. So that if you see someone who is without things that you have in abundance, you may feel that you're willing to give up some of what you have in order to assist them. And that's self-gratifying. I mean, it's not a selfless action. So that when you give to other people voluntarily, you're doing it because it makes you feel better, in large part, and because it is consistent with your moral codes rather than contradictory, which would cause a great deal of conflict. If you walk past that person, you would be in conflict with yourself. Why didn't I help them? So whenever you engage other people with those kind of empathetic actions, it is consistent with, it doesn't contradict this idea of egoism as we see as a component of capitalism. So life should be a celebration of every human being, not of only ourselves. And egoism is part of that. I am valuable, you are valuable. None of us are more valuable to humanity than others. We accept this sort of humility about our contribution, and that we develop this empathy for others who face the same human challenges that we do. And we discover through these sort of voluntary arrangements how to make our lives better off while serving others' self-interest. So that this is what market transactions are about, allowing individuals to align their values, align their self-interest, as Adam Smith used the reference, through an invisible hand. So the invisible hand is a process through which people are able to bring their self-interest and values into alignment through cooperation. Now, an important sort of overlay to all of these behavioral patterns is the rule of law. Now, the rule of law is not the same thing as legislation. Legislation can violate the rule of law. In fact, most legislative acts and most parliaments, most assemblies do just that, because most, whether in democracies or other types of political systems, most legislative acts, the rules that come out of bureaucracies as well, involve redistribution of some sort. That is, the assignment of privileges, the granting of subsidies. Now, these are violating the rule of law, because the rule of law specifies that everyone must be treated equally before the law. Now, that means no privileges, no subsidies. That is because if you grant a subsidy, you impose an obligation on one group or one individual to transfer some of their riches or their resources to other people. So in other words, one individual or group is treated better and one is treated worse. So the rule of law is an essential element that we need to guide us. And unfortunately, it is not guiding legislature or parliamentarians to inhibit the kind of rules, or bureaucrats, the kind of rules that they impose on the rest of us that lead to unequal application of laws, so that one group becomes a servant to another group through this redistributive legislation. Now, here's another moral criticism that is directed towards capitalism. The suggestion is that capitalism induces humans to care about their own status. And in fact, they're constantly seeking to be above people rather than remaining equal to them. Now, again, this was an implicit, not an implicit, but this is the argument that could be used by Marxists to address class struggle, where we have these uneven distributions of power, and that if we only had equal power among all individuals, then the world would live more harmoniously. But let's unwrap this a bit. It turns out that it is true that individuals are constantly pursuing some sort of material standards or well-being in their life, but they are generally guided by certain moral rules, moral responsibilities, if you will, moral sensibilities, moral instincts. And this guides us toward, and under the rule of law, within a capitalist system where property rights are maintained and where there's a minimal amount of state interference that would provide privileges or protections for one group over another, then what we find is that market transactions actually encourage people to treat other people equally, to treat them well. So if you mistreat your customers, you won't keep them. My father had a business in the United States where whoever walked in the door, it didn't matter what his attitudes would be about the way they were dressed, the way they looked. He would always greet them as though they were very welcome. If he had behaved otherwise, he would have lost customers. So this is the case with every sort of business where you are compelled, not necessarily even by your own moral positions or your tendencies towards discriminate against people. Maybe you don't like people that have long hair or a beard or whatever it may be. But if you don't treat them with equal respect, then you will lose business. You'll be less profitable. So what happens is that market exchange increases bonding with other people. That is, you treat strangers as friends, so to speak. And it also, repetitive market exchanges lead to an increase in the level of trust. That is, you expect that when you, in Singapore, for example, if you go to a hawker stall, you are unlikely to become ill because you trust that the provider understands that if he makes his customers ill, they won't come back. So this creates a level of trust, and it may not need government enforcement, because what we'll see is that the the interest of the company or the firm will be in alignment with the desires of the customers to remain healthy. Now, here's some other moral criticism. For example, capitalism supposedly encourages people to avoid being public spirited, that is, participating in the community, and instead to be only concerned with yourself. Well, in a way, we've already discussed this, but it turns out that persistent antisocial behavior in a world characterized by scarcity is not sustainable. That is, if you act against the other people in a community, or indeed in your family, you will not be able to be a functioning element of that community. You'll either be ostracized, driven away, in the extreme, perhaps imprisoned, by undertaking that antisocial behavior. Now, seeking profits is a way of not separating yourself from others, but engaging others. Capitalism, the search for profits through entrepreneurial action, is all about trying to interpret what other people want, what other people value. So capitalism is not about atomistic individualism. It's about social behavior, that is, interacting with other human beings to find out what can make your life better by making their lives better, and entering into a cooperative arrangement so that your interests and values are in alignment. Now, another criticism of capitalism is that capitalism encourages humans to treat others as instruments, that is, a means, rather than thinking of their intrinsic value, that is, as an end. So this is suggesting that capitalism violates Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, whereby we must view human beings as ends rather than means. This is a mischaracterization of capitalism, because market behavior, as I've mentioned in earlier references, market behavior requires and promotes trust, fairness, and reciprocity. So these are not treating other people as a means. It's suggesting that the actions within markets are treating other people and trying to discover the values that those people possess and how they align with yours. And the reciprocity comes from the exchange, the voluntary exchange of either in money or in goods and services, or it could be a non-monetary transfer. Now, market activity is based on self-ownership. Now, self-ownership, in a simple phrase, is, to me, unchallengeable, because self-ownership is about the absence of slavery, the absence of an imposed hierarchy or an imposed dominance. Self-ownership means that you and every human being must be allowed to own themselves and not be owned by others, which means that whatever you produce lawfully and peacefully is yours based on moral and legal judgments, and that what you have produced is your property. So self-ownership, the absence of slavery, is the fundamental basis for this idea of private property, so that it's impossible to detach what I produced and own from me as a human. So that if you were to steal my laptop, it's as though you enslaved me or had kidnapped me for the amount of time it took for me to earn the income to buy that laptop. So this is why theft is wrong, because theft is an implicit type of slavery. You've enslaved the others because you have taken away from them something that they worked to possess. So that market activities based, we need self-ownership. In other words, this gives us a moral argument for private property. And we, in order to enjoy these gains in our material well-being, we need to have this process by which we can make these transfers, these voluntary transfers, and the market allows that to happen. We can improve our lives by engaging in increased amounts of trade and exchange with others. Now, so in order to get what we want, we need to act in ways that ensure that the demands for other people can be met. So this is what all of us must recognize, that we all, in order to have what we desire, requires that we act in ways that best ensure that demands can be met. Now, so justice and morality are essential elements of human interaction and guide us in terms of whether or not our social order is one which is stable, which is broadly, in other words, broadly acceptable, and will survive over generations. Now let's think of justice. First of all, our natural, according to our nature as human beings, what constitutes a human being? It doesn't indicate at all what is right and wrong. These are things that we must discover. Justice, like morality, is not something that we are born with. It's not something that's just out there. It's not something that just exists as a rock that we can go and pray before. So there's no objective or a priori standard about what is just or what is unjust. These things evolve, and our understanding of this evolved over time, across generations, and will differ within a given segment of time from country to country or civilization to civilization. Now, the idea of social justice is a somewhat problematic idea in the sense that it is being utilized as a very broad sweep form of denunciation of particular outcomes. In particular, the progressives or social democrats in many different countries are trying to use the concept of social justice to actually impose or enforce their own peculiar sense of what is just, as though it were objective. And the pretense here is that somehow putting the adjective social before it gives it a higher moral standing. And this is false, because almost all the social justice proponents within the political framework, they're all in favor of expanding the power of the state, that is the political power of the agents of the state or government. And they're all in favor of redistribution towards what they believe is an appropriate distribution of income and wealth. Now, the way I would try to explain social justice is that all individuals must be treated as equal. Everyone is included in the assessment, and they're all considered of equal value components of humanity. Not that the social justice concepts of progressives and social democrats are that if you're rich, you must give up to other people what you lawfully, legally, and peacefully have acquired. In other words, you have less value. You must serve the others. So instead of creating these class distinctions of the rich and the poor, the 1% or whatever, we we need to embrace humanity from the viewpoint of individuals rather than collectives. So if we collectives are completely arbitrary, whether we talk about countries, borders are arbitrary. There's no, I mean, if we look at in history, the borders of Italy, for example, as they exist today, did not exist in the same manner 100 years ago. India, what is identified as India today, those borders are completely arbitrary. So, and classes are arbitrary, gender is somewhat arbitrary. All aggregations tend to lead to problematic interpretations, and these will exist as long as we do not focus on the individual as the appropriate point of interest when we're engaging in social science, or if we're interpreting moral actions, or if we're trying to discuss the idea of justice and injustice. Now, what is our duty of justice? Well, again, this is an individual interpretation. So each individual will be bound to other individuals in a community or a family, for example, based upon a mutual acceptance of what is just and unjust behavior, and only if you respect that other people have the exact same rights, that no one has a privilege over you. So that this is a willful, a voluntary acceptance then of what is just and unjust, so that each individual is bound to the other people. That is, you interact with other people because of the mutual acceptance of what is just and unjust, and that you all value each other equally. Now, by acknowledging the rights of other peoples, this protects us. It protects us from fraud, and it protects them, of course. It protects them from undue interference, that is, arbitrary decisions to interfere with your cooperative interactions with other people, and also unwarranted aggression. So these are important aspects of the behavior within a system that would lead to justice. Now, I'll explore now some market interactions in order to begin to move back towards Milton Friedman's famous or infamous remark that profits are the social responsibility of businesses. Now, as I mentioned before, cooperation is the essence of market transactions. So cooperation is a good thing. I mean, it's an unambiguously good thing. It means that you do it in order to make yourself better off by making someone else better off. So this leads to these voluntary market exchanges where you're transferring some form of property. Could be a deed, it could be a physical good, like a laptop, could be a service, whatever it may be. Something that was acquired by using what was rightfully owned, including your own labor. So selling one's labor is a much better cooperative outcome through a voluntary process than being enslaved. And this is what, in general, we find under capitalism, is that workers within their own standard of values. Now, it may be that you feel limited in your values because you might refuse to move, or you may be constrained by border restrictions, or there are other external factors, some of which are imposed through part of an imposed social order through government actions like a border. But in general, we have a broad range of choices about how we cooperate in the labor market in the same way that we cooperate in the product market to buy goods and services. Now, voluntary trades are are guided by mutual self-interest, and in doing so, we're considering the other active participants in this decision-making process. Now, the result is that we're promoting human liberty. So capitalism will only work well if we have human liberty. So human liberty to trade with whoever we wish, human liberty to be entrepreneurs, to produce things that are of value, or to search for things and produce them that are of value to others. As a worker, we have the liberty to sell our labor or not to others. It encourages prosperity because the dynamism associated with the search for opportunities to exchange things of value, either through entrepreneurship or through the consumption and production process, is what leads to prosperity. Adam Smith's famous remark that the specialization and division of labor arising from an extended boundary of markets is what leads to rising productivity. So the specialization and division of labor leads to rising productivity that is the basis for increased wages and salaries to the workers, which is the source of rising living standards. And this is where Karl Marx was missed his interpretation of the outcome of the Industrial Revolution, which he believed would lead to persistent misery of the proletariat, whereas what we found is where capitalism prevailed over the century and a half since the Industrial Revolution began, is that workers under those systems were able to prosper and certainly be infinitely better off than their counterparts were before the Industrial Revolution, or even at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So capitalism and the interactions with other human beings within a capitalist system rewards integrity. That is, to be honest, if you're dishonest in dealings, people will avoid you. To be punctual, if you do not appear at an appointed time, it suggests that you don't value the other person because you don't value their time. And time is the ultimate scarce resource. So if you're late, you are indicating to other people that you don't value their life. So punctuality is this civic virtue that comes out of market exchange, because you realize it's necessary to be able to participate in those interactive processes, whether it's working for someone or meeting for a contract negotiation, whatever it may be. And propriety, in other words, proper behavior. Here at the American Institute for Economic Research, we have a dress code. So people must behave in a proper manner. No coming in with shorts and sandals. You're expected to come in business casual. So proper behavior is both rewarded, and the idea of proper behavior emerges from these human interactions within this market exchange process. So what we find is that markets, as I mentioned before, encourage and reward social cooperation. So this is what cooperation is. It's humans cooperating with other humans. So capitalism is not about atomistic individuals. It's about social cooperation through market exchanges. And this leads to social harmony. That is, we begin to, through these civic virtues that we develop, we live more harmonious lives. It encourages respect for strangers. It's a form of love that we develop. It's not the same as a physical love, but it's an understanding that we have this sort of feeling for our fellow human beings. And if we don't, the market process will punish us. Now, more market exchanges lead to more social interactions, more honesty, due to adverse results if we break promises. So let's look at private property quickly. As I mentioned, the philosophical basis can be found in private property, supported by a number of modern thinkers, philosophers, that everyone owns their own physical body, and thus everything that they are able to produce. So self-ownership is the underlying concept that, and even the idea of homesteading is supported by this. The property is the right of use of resources as you see fit, if you own them. So your labor, the state should not tell you that you cannot be if you decide to engage in euthanasia, to end your own life, that's a moral judgment of your own. The controversial issues like prostitution. At one time, homosexuality was considered both immoral and illegal. Uses of one's body in the act of love for another human being. And these violate this idea of self-ownership. And many of these have these rules, these moral structures have changed over time. Now, Karl Marx saw private property as the problem. And if we could only get rid of private property, there would be a better life. So he started his analysis with production relations, that the private ownership of capital was the source of human misery. By contrast, Adam Smith said private property is the solution. It solved these problems of conflicts over scarcity, arising from scarcity, because it gave us a mechanism by which we could solve the conflict over the use of resources in a peaceful way. Now, profits, looking at Friedman's claim, they are really community values. They're the outcome of community values. Because if the market is unprotected, if market participants do not have the protection of the state or some legislative rules that either protect them, suppress competition, or give them a privilege that other businesses don't have, then profits are the outcome of voluntary arrangements that reflect community values. And if we deny the moral content of profits, we're saying that community choice, community judgments are invalid. And this is a strong claim, which I think most of you would find problematic. That, in fact, we should respect the expression of community values. Now, the claims of morality and legitimacy. Now, if we earn a profit in a competitive market, meaning that there's no state interference with competition, no privileges, and there's voluntary exchange, then these trades are both moral and just according to the people who participated in that exchange. So you would not enter into a voluntary exchange unless you believe it was moral, according to your moral standards, and just, that is fair. You think you only engage in that transfer if you think the terms of the trade are fair with respect to your own position. Now, when profits are earned through government protections or privileges, these are illegitimate. So that monopolists that have a position based upon the state granting a monopoly, for example, in India under the license Raj, where certain private businesses were granted a monopoly by the state of India, by the socialist government of Nehru, then these are illegitimate profits. Profits are only legitimate when they've been earned through a competitive process in absence of state intervention. Now, being profitable is actually fulfilling your social responsibility. If you're a firm, you are, in order to be profitable, you have to align your actions with the interests and values of your, not only your customers, the buyers of your output, but also your suppliers and if you fail to do so, then the capital owners will lose. The suppliers will lose access to sales. The consumers will find either fewer choices, maybe higher prices, and workers will have fewer jobs. So that being profitable secures the conditions, not only the capital owners, because they're only one player here, but also the suppliers of that particular activity, and also the workers in that particular activity, and the consumers of that particular activity. So this is, in fact, a social responsibility. In order to protect the interests of all those groups, then you must earn a profit, because if you don't, the suppliers lose customers, your customers lose a valued and desired product or service, and the workers lose their jobs. So I think from that perspective, then I would agree with both Deng Xiaoping and Milton Friedman. To be rich is glorious, because in order to be rich in a competitive market, that is to earn profits, you have to have served the interests of other people. And so the other message behind both of these individuals, Milton Friedman and Deng Xiaoping, is that people should not be jealous. They should not try to of people who become rich through profitable activities. They should not interfere with them. They should imitate them. If you want to make society better off, become an entrepreneur, become rich, because the only way you can become rich in a competitive market economy that depends upon cooperative and voluntary exchange is to make other people better off. You make the workers better off, more jobs, usually higher wages. Your suppliers are better off, more customers, and so on. Now, a few quick remarks. So, what is good about profits and competitive free enterprise capitalism is that it provides incentives for moral behavior. Now, I'll refer to you to the work by Deirdre McCluskey and what she identified as bourgeois values to learn more about that. It aligns the interests of owners, suppliers, workers, and consumers that generate net social benefits because of the economic dynamism that's generated through this market process. This rising productivity of workers leads to higher living standards. Now, capitalism, it's necessary to have maximal human liberty under capitalism and equal and universal rights, because this is the basis of human existence. Now, the choice between capitalism and socialism is not only a choice between different social systems. So it's not that we just flip a coin and one will be as good as the other for humans to live a good life. In fact, that's not true. If you choose socialism, you're choosing a system that interferes with social cooperation. It interferes with voluntary interactions. And it leads to a disintegration of civilization. What we saw in the Soviet Union was a complete collapse of civil society, that people did not trust one another. They were envious of one another because usually in a socialist system, people acquired things by taking away from other people. In a capitalist system, under competitive conditions, individuals acquire things by making other people better off. So it's a win-win situation. So socialism is not really a good alternative to capitalism. It's a way of choosing to live outside a moral community. So socialism is not a moral, it's not an institution that's either guided by objective morality, nor can it or does it lead to moral outcomes. It actually leads to a deterioration, a degradation of moral behavior. So to support this, it's a general understanding of mine that whenever the state or government officials tries to impose morality, they do so by minimizing the role, the choices of individuals and markets, which leads to a potential for the abuse of political power. And this is really why those wonderful experiments of communism in the Soviet Union and mainland China until its modernization process began, why they failed is that they allowed the abuse of political power, the subjugation of the individual to be a servant of a system rather than the system serving the individual human being. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Lingle. We'll move on to our question and answer segment right now. So starting with the first question, the success of the individual or a business is never always private. If you succeed in society, you probably enlisted some help from others. You owe your success in some way to society. In a similar way, a business relies on public courts, laws, and sometimes favorable government policies. So considering this, shouldn't businesses give some of their profits to society? I suppose this sort of relates to altruism, which you brought up in your presentation.
Well, President Barack Obama, when he was president of the United States, made the remark suggesting you did not build that. That is, the success of entrepreneurs was based upon the activities or the provision of things that were provided by other people, perhaps people that had input, or perhaps the state. Now, I'm going to challenge that. Now, it turns out that if you suggest that success in the market depends upon the state providing physical infrastructure like roads and bridges, well, it turns out the state didn't build that, in the sense that the state acquires nothing that they didn't take away from someone else, and it's the private sector. Anything that the state is able to do is based upon private actions that preceded it that provided tax revenues for the state. So what we find then is that all success in markets is traced back not to the state, but to individual success that enable them to have a high enough level of income to be able to pay tribute to the state in the form of taxes. Now, is there an obligation to contribute your profits to the state? Now, the obligation may be legal, but it's not clear that the obligation is moral in the sense that I've just explained it. That is, shouldn't I reward the descendants of people who paid taxes that enabled the state to build the road and bridges that were provided, rather than paying the state? Because that was the origin of that physical infrastructure. The state could never have accomplished that. And by the way, for example, in the United States, in the early days of the colonies and then early days of the US Republic, most roads through wilderness areas, which was very difficult at that time, were private. So we can have a lot of these things that are associated with state provision that can actually be provided by the private sector. So I don't, then it comes to the question, what amount must I give to the state? Well, that becomes quite contentious. If you think about what is, if taxes are the means for redistribution of income and wealth, then it suggests an open-ended set of obligation, because the political agents decide on that redistributive process. However, if you think of taxes as an enabling mechanism whereby the state might provide certain basic arrangements could be justice, could be security, but nothing more. That is, in other words, taxes should not be a form or source of redistribution by the state. Then people would voluntarily pay taxes, because taxes then become a user fee. So what's happened, and the reason people oppose taxation today, is that number one, tax rates have become too high. And number two, taxes have become an instrument of so-called social justice, that is redistribution of income and wealth, rather than an enabling mechanism to make the community better off.
Right. So earlier in your presentation, you alluded to Friedman's watershed essay. The social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. So the main thrust of his argument is that profits should be the overriding concern of businesses. However, many others have seen it as a time capitalist manifesto, which outlines the exploitation of a free market. So should businesses help ameliorate societal ills, for example, by providing employment to the long-term unemployed, or fighting discrimination and pollution? In other words, should businesses abandon profit for social equity and justice?
Again, the question really reveals a lack of understanding of the nature of market processes. Market processes are at their heart a social phenomenon. That is, and they are a cooperative social phenomenon. So that if I am engaging in market activities as a profit-seeking business or an entrepreneur, I'm engaging the social community, and they are communicating to me what they value most. Now, if you're, for example, when it comes to something like the minimum wage as a legislatively imposed wage, the problem with workers not receiving higher wages is the problem that consumers, that households, because of their own budget constraints, are unable or unwilling to pay a high enough price for those things that are produced by that worker in order for them to earn a higher wage. So the problem there is not the employer. The problem is the consumer, the household, the housewife, your mom, who refuses to give up what is good for her family to pay a higher price for a product or a service that might allow a worker to have a higher wage. So this is not something that we need to accuse employers of. We must take credit for that. We must take the blame for that, because it's our decision out of our budget constraints in terms of how we interact in the market. Now, if I earn a profit, I'm able to satisfy the interests, the demands, the requirements of my customers. That is, as long as these are voluntary transactions, they are cooperating with me. Now, if I remain profitable, I can buy from my suppliers. They are better off, and their workers are better off. If my business is profitable, capital owners are better off. So all of these groups of society that are involved directly, in some cases indirectly, with that business activity, are made better off by it. This is a positive social outcome. It is not that profits go into the pockets only of, profits are not the only aspect of a market transaction. If we look at the distribution of revenues from a typical business, about 90% of the expenditures go to labor, and roughly 5% goes to capital. So capital owners get a small fraction of the total amount. Now, if it's concentrated in the hands of one individual, it may seem like a large amount, but relative to the amount of economic activity involved, it's a relatively small fraction. Now, again, when it comes to labor, there's lots of people involved there, so that's distributed over a large group of people. So that looks that creates this impression of an imbalance or maybe even an unfairness. But in fact, this is a reality of the nature of profits. So in fact, we are satisfying some of the social requirements. Now, the other thing, I do not look to a corporate official, a CEO, for understanding of the truth of life and my interactions with humanity. And corporations have no input, in my view, and no role in being guardians of moral behavior. I mean, this is where people are trying to have it both ways. On one hand, you're saying, oh, these corporations are only greedy individuals who oppress and alienate workers. On the other hand, oh, it's wonderful when corporate heads repeat a meme or a narrative that is in agreement with my own. You can't have it both ways. Corporations, in my view, should not be involved in the social dialogue about what is good and appropriate behavior.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree with that. Yeah, so staying on Friedman for a bit, some of his critics have argued that the what is good for shareholders is good for society ethos, the very idea of egoism that you alluded to in your presentation, only works where markets perform perfectly. So does Friedman's argument assume that markets are perfect? If it does not, what explanation or reparations does he offer?
The idea of perfectly competitive or perfectly functioning markets is really a classroom exercise that no good economist tries to apply to the real world. Human beings are imperfect, whether or not they're capitalists or government employees, bureaucrats, or politicians. It doesn't require a framework of perfection in order for Friedman's comments to be true or to be a correct reference to human reality. Now, profits don't only go to shareholders, that is, people who own shares of stock in a particular company. Many companies are not, don't have shareholders. Many of them, mom and pop shops, corner stores. In fact, many tens of thousands, millions of small businesses don't have shareholders. They may have owners, but they may not have, they're not publicly traded companies. But in any case, what we find is even with the publicly traded companies, if the shareholders are better off, they made all these other people better off. Remember, the shareholders receive earnings out of the profits, which are a small fraction of the corporate revenues. But who are the other beneficiaries? The suppliers. Who are the other beneficiaries? The workers. Who are the other beneficiaries? Consumers. So in this sense, it was kind of a willful misinterpretation of Friedman's remarks to suggest that he was only supporting the interests of shareholders when he was not.
So now let's move over to the digital world. So in today's digital data-hungry world, many have big tech companies done wrong by their users. There's been a cascade of antitrust lawsuits against big tech over the exploitation of user data, the most infamous of which is perhaps the 2018 Facebook Cambridge Analytica saga, in which there was leakage of over 78 million Facebook users' data. It reveals a disturbing trend of business infringing on consumer privacy. So should society be opposed to the enforcement of ethical standards in business? Is there too much room for businesses to violate consumers' trust and rights?
Well, so much of the big data that we have that is at the disposal of some tech companies. Almost all of it was given voluntarily. Now, it is the case that many people didn't anticipate how it might be used, but the exchange process was in play there, that you granted access to that because you received something in return for it. Access to Facebook, access to Twitter, access to Amazon, whatever it may be. And so there was a quid pro quo involved with that. Now, I would be, and I am, much more distrustful of the abuse of big data by governments than by corporations. One can take legal action against corporations that you cannot take against governments. One can boycott private corporations in a way that you can't boycott or evade or avoid the acts of the state, and so on. So even though I might share some distrust or disquiet with the abuses of tech companies with respect to big data, I'm more worried about, for example, like the use of big data in a social credit system like developed in China, and which is being imitated around the world by governments in so-called liberal democracies, where something like a health app will be used by governments in order to monitor people's behavior or what might be considered misbehavior, and use that to punish them in some way, perhaps not give them access to right to travel or the right to enter into a bar or restaurant. So be careful what you ask for, because when you allow the state to impose antitrust legislation to break up big companies, you're granting increased political power to people who are currently in office who do not reflect any sort of objective conditions of reality. It's their subjective interpretation of what's right and wrong. So I would be opposed, as a general rule, to now in America, the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed by the brother of General Tecumseh Sherman, who used his authority as a general in the Civil War to destroy most of the physical infrastructure in the South. And I would suggest to you that the application of the Sherman Antitrust law would have a similar effect on the US economy as the General Sherman had on the infrastructure of the Confederacy, which was utter destruction in the limit. So I'm very skeptical about antitrust actions.